昭和41年頃、姉さんたちには懐かしい青春の日々。でも私は当時小学校5年生。あ、七子姉さん、私太子。今日出発するけど、お母さんは？
今日はお出かけ。でも怒ってたわよ。あなたお見合い断ったでしょ。27にもなってあんないいお話もうないわよって。
お母さんったらそればっか。
雨の人、曇りの人、晴れと、どれが一番好き？曇り。あ、同じだ。
でも考えた方がいいわよ。あなたももう若くないんだから。
そうかしら。
そうよ。いつまでもルンルン気分じゃダメよ。それにあなたも物好きね。去年は野良仕事まで手伝ったんだって。
そうよ、稲刈り。今年はね、紅花摘むの。
紅花？
そう。あの頃をしきりに思い出すのは、私にさなぎの季節が再び巡ってきたからなのだろうか。
On tonight's episode, we'll cover the quick history of animation powerhouse of the East, Studio Ghibli, the film that spawned my love of Japanese cinema and its animation, and much, much more. Welcome to Movie Club. Roll the intro, Johnny! Welcome one and all back to Movie Club, and welcome to 2021. Happy New Year. You made it. I'm your host and curator of sorts around these parts, Patrick Smith, and tonight we'll be digging into the Studio Ghibli 1991 film. It also happens to be a coming-of-age movie and a romance of sorts, only yesterday. Now this is one of my favorite movies, and it's one of the two films I credit with introducing me to Eastern cinema, but specifically Japanese cinema. The other film in this group would be Akira Kurosawa's brilliant Macbeth adaptation, Throne of Blood, starring Toshiro Mifune. If you're an American, you probably haven't heard a ton about Studio Ghibli unless you're just super into Japanese cinema and Japanese animation in general. But you might have heard of them in reference to like Disney Animation and Pixar, because they are effectively that animation studio of the East. And in many regards, they've created movies that are on par and some that are, dare I say, even better than what Disney has been offering. And they've been doing it for quite a long time too. Studio Ghibli is a beloved Japanese animation house, and they were founded 35 years ago back in 1985 in the city of Tokyo. And since then, they have animated worlds and characters that have become beloved by people around the world, like Spirited Away and My Neighbor Totoro. Studio Ghibli is responsible for 6 of the 10 highest grossing animated films of all time. And that's no small feat, with companies like Disney and Pixar competing here in the West. Second on the highest grossing list is their film Spirited Away, which is probably what they're most known for, and it's one of the most gorgeously animated films you will ever see. They were founded by 4 men, and I'm going to refer to my notes for this one because I'm going to butcher the pronunciations of their names, but I at least like to take a nice good crack at it. Hayao Miyazaki is one of the 4 men that founded this company and is credited with shepherding most of the movies that they produced into their final forms. Miyazaki is a name that animation buffs worldwide know because he's one of the big guys here at Ghibli and is responsible for most of their output. The other 3 founders of Studio Ghibli are as follows: Toshio Suzuki, Isao Takahata, and Yasuyoshi Tokuma. These 3 men, along with Miyazaki, are some of the most incredible minds in animation, and the fact that Studio Ghibli is still going after all these years is a testament to their success worldwide.
日本のアニメ界を代表する高畑と宮崎、この2人の巨匠は長年にわたってライバルとして競い合い、アニメーションの可能性を追い続けてきた。
Takahata is actually the one who wrote the screenplay for tonight's film and directed it. And only yesterday, at least in the grand scheme of what Studio Ghibli has released, is quite a bit different. This film isn't as fantastical, it's not as weird, it's not as populated with like fantasy characters. It's much more of a slice of life anime, and that's not typically what Studio Ghibli does, even if they do kind of capture that genre very well here.
もしこういう風な子供像が映画で作れたら、これは意味があるなっていうのを思ったんです。それだけです、僕が思ったの。そこから先これは映画になるかって言ったらならないと思ったんです。だから僕は初め映画にすまいと思ってできませんって言ってね、しばらく机の上に掘り出して暇の時聞くれと読んでたんですよ。でやっぱりなんかこれに出会ってしまうとね、子供のものを作る時にこれを録音して作るのはね、なんか面白くないなと思ったことも事実ですね。ただ僕はそういう力量がないから、これをこうああでもないこうでもやってジグソーパズルをやってね、とにかく映画にしちゃってることができるのはどうも高畑勲ぐらいだろうと。
Only Yesterday is based upon a manga of the same name by Hotaru Okamoto and Yuko Tone. Fantastic writers, and they helped inspire one of my favorite movies. Typically, Ghibli is responsible for some of the most imaginative worlds out there in animation. And I would argue they rival Pixar with the storytelling that they do. But in fact, tonight's film, despite being released elsewhere in 1991, was not released here until very recently. It wasn't until 2016 that this film finally made its way across the pond to us here in North America. They've been hiding a gem for us for decades, because I would argue, at least in my humble opinion, this is my favorite Ghibli film, and one of my favorite films of all time. The animation in this film is gorgeous, par for the course for Ghibli, but it's also just so refreshing and different, and such an honest portrayal of this story that it's hard not to fall in love with it.
1991年夏、このゴールデンコンビの最新作が公開された。 映画「思い出ポロポロ」にはどこにでもいる27歳の独身を終える妙子ともう一人10歳の頃の妙子が登場する。小学校5年生の頃の思い出を連れて妙子は10日間の旅に出る。
I was lucky enough to see the 2016 theatrical release here in the States thanks to G Kids, who is responsible for porting most of Ghibli's output to the States. The version that was released here in theaters was an English dub with the voices of Daisy Ridley and Dev Patel in the title roles. And while I'm much more of a subbed, not dubbed guy, I'm glad that this film helped introduce and usher me into a new world of cinema, one that I would not have explored on my own prior to this. And thankfully, Daisy Ridley had just been coming off of her success of the first of the new Star Wars movies, Star Wars Episode 7, The Force Awakens. This, I think, brought more attention to this film than otherwise would have been granted it. Because Daisy Ridley was such a big name, big household name at the time, more people were willing to give this film a chance. And that includes me. Regardless of how you feel about the new Star Wars movies, I fell in love with this version of the film immediately. And now, tonight we will be screening the subbed version, as I think you should with these films, because the original cast gives such a rich and deeply nuanced performance that it would be a shame to miss out on that. And while the English language voice cast gives a great performance, and I think you should check it out just to, you know, get a little bit more of a different view of the film, especially one that's being redone and dubbed over decades after the fact, I think you need to watch the original for how great the performances are. And yes, that means requires a lot of reading, but the best films really are worth working for. And here, honestly, the story's so good that I think you're going to forget about that very, very quickly. Only Yesterday is split between two timelines, and that is the childhood of Taiko from 1966 and her present-day life, now as a 27-year-old woman. And the way these two stories in this one single life are weaved together, the best vantage point, the best, I guess, guiding mark I can give you for a recent American film that does this very similarly would be Greta Gerwig's 2019 adaptation of Little Women. With the reflexive style of storytelling bouncing back and forth between the two timelines in Little Women, you get this kind of drain circling to this moment, with the childhood story influencing how we interpret the adult story, and the most important stuff happening at the center. The style of storytelling is very well done here, and it allows for us to experience both the wisdom and the naivete of childhood, and also the wisdom of adulthood with the cherished memories of childhood. And the animation reflects this as well, which I think is just yet another great nuanced touch that they do. The childhood scenes, save for the characters, are more sketches than anything. The backgrounds are kind of a muted palette, and really the characters are the only things that are super richly defined. In fact, when Taiko's childhood self finds herself outside during these scenes, the background just kind of fades away into this tan color almost, and the sky is practically non-existent. This gives us this idea, I would say, of like remembering childhood. You remember it in fits and starts and sketches, not as it actually fully was. I think Only Yesterday communicates this in such a beautiful and visual way that no other film I've seen has really managed to come close to doing. One thing I definitely love about Japanese cinema is how slow and deliberate every one of their films seem to be. And I think it's because now, and especially in American cinema, cutting is getting faster and faster, and action is getting bigger and bigger. And so it's nice to have movies that you can go and sit down in and just breathe and reflect yourself about what your childhood was like at that age. Have the moment to truly feel the emotions that Taiko is going through herself. To truly empathize with those characters, because you get to sit in those moments with them.
いわゆるこう実写の映像はですね、ほとんど現実と同じになっちゃってると思うんですよ、今。もうあまりにも溢れてるから。その現実の映像を
それじゃない、その実写の映像を見てもですね、その中で丁寧に観察なんかしてないと思うんですよ、見る人は。ところがアニメーションにするとですね、観察させられちゃう、書き起こしてるからね、その現実よりはもっとこのなんていうかな、くっきりと浮き上がるんですね、その浮かび上がるんですよ、やってることが。あ、こんなことやってたんだなと、その実はということに気が付く機会を提供することになると思うんですね、アニメーションって。
I think the true masters of cinema in general, but especially the masters of Japanese cinema, know how to get every single drop, every single emotion that you possibly can out of every single frame in their film. And here, I don't think Only Yesterday wastes a single moment of its nearly 2-hour runtime.
The key elements of all Japanese animation is that they are willing to go to all that trouble to animate little inconsequential moments. Somebody just doing a little behavior, somebody adjusting their clothing, or just turning around and then turning back. And so the fact that they give themselves the luxury of putting in extra stuff, additional stuff. The Fireflies, for example, that in Grave of the Fireflies, that they used to illuminate their cave, are very beautiful, and they are given a little moment of silence and contemplation and mystery.
One thing I have noticed, I haven't seen a ton of Studio Ghibli films, but one thing I definitely have noticed through watching a good portion of them is that trains and just constant motion are a very big motif across their work, because it has this illusion of stillness while continuously moving, much like the passage of time. Now that I've rattled on for quite a bit of time, I'm looking at my clock right now, quite a bit of time, I do want to tell you a little bit about the story that you're about to experience. I kind of alluded to it already, but it's centered on this girl named Taiko, and it travels between 1966, when she was a child in 5th grade, and to her current life at age 27, and how different their lives that she was leading at those two different periods are, and what she can learn from both her childhood self and the maturity that she's gained across those years that intervene. It also reminds us that it's okay to lean back into your childhood and remember what that was like, and because there are nuggets of wisdom that we seemingly forget as we grow older and grow more grizzled and nihilistic. Here, Taiko takes the time to listen to her younger self, to listen to her dreams, and consider if she's actually been following them or she's been living a shadow of a life.
こんな作品で皆さんがプロデューサーやってなかったら絶対にできないですからね。作れないですよ、こんな。何がさっぱり分かんないはずですから、普通で言うとね、こんな原作当たるのかなとかね、思うに決まってるんですよ。それからしかもできたのが27歳のね、なんだか知らんけどドラマティックでもないね、そのしかもなんか難しそうでアニメーションで成功しにくそうなね、そんなものやどうかしてるって普通だったら不安でたまらないのね。その宮崎プロデューサーがですね、これなんじゃって言ったらですね、まあ間違いないんじゃないかなと思ってね、ついその安心してしまうとかね、そういうことによって成り立ってるんですよ、これ。それからお金がかかっちゃったっていうのもね、まあ、仕方がないんじゃないか、かかっても取り返せるかもしれないっていうようなことは何から来てるか、宮崎駿から来てるんじゃないですかね。もうはっきりしてると思います。
And finds that she's encouraged to try to find a new way to fly. And if that isn't a great piece of advice for all of us as we move into this new year, 2021, I don't know what is. One of the other things I really love about this material is that it conveys some adult themes in, I think, really nuanced and beautiful ways. It, by talking frankly about it, removes stigma around things that young girls experience in coming-of-age moments in their own lives, specifically talking about periods. By the way that they go about it, they show how it can be stigmatized in society, but also provide young girls with tools to deal with this and to not be ashamed of it. And the fact that a film in 1991 was doing this kind of conversation, I think is very, very important. And we should cherish it, but we should also do more of this, please. Please, God, do more of this. Before we move forward, this is an animated film. That's what Studio Ghibli does. But I want to dissuade you from a notion that I've seen pervasive across media. Writers and all kinds of people, even critics, sometimes demean animated films as made for children. And I really want to dissuade you from believing that. Because I think that demeans the incredible work that went into creating films like Only Yesterday, and creating films like Soul, and so many other great Disney animation and Studio Ghibli and Pixar films. If an animated film is doing right by its audience, it's not just appealing to children. It's lovingly and intelligently interacting with those children and not demeaning their experiences, but also being approachable and reminding adults what it's like to be a child. The wonder, the majesty, the mystery, the naivete of being a child, and how glorious that is, and allow us to live in those moments for just a second and reconnect with our childhood dreams. That's what animation should do. That is its purpose. Just like the rest of cinema. It allows us to connect with ourselves at different places and to imagine ourselves in lives we never have led and never will lead. But also allow us to aspire for greater things in our current circumstances. And right now, in the middle of a pandemic, it allows us to remember what life was like before all of this. And for a brief 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever it runs, and allows you to breathe for a second. As so happens with all kinds of coming-of-age films, specifically for me, I mean, if I'm thinking back to our second ever episode, Booksmart, I'm thinking these movies remind me about the passage of time, but they also remind me of my own childhood. And as I get closer and closer to Taika's age in this film, in her adult years, I turned 25 this year. And every year that I get closer and closer to that age of 27, to that point in her life, I vibe more and more with Taika as a person and just her general disposition towards life. As we wrap up this video, because I know I've talked way too long, my audio clock down there says I've been talking for about 35 minutes. Wow. One of the things that's always fascinated me about this movie is the fact that though this movie is about Taika going on a vacation, so much of the movie is spent getting to that place. We're nearly an hour into the film before she even arrives at her vacation, despite the opening moments conveying to us that that's the entire destination of this film. And I think what we should learn from this is that it's not about the destination, it's about the journey that we take to get there, and then the journey that we take on the way back. Because by the end of this film, not only has Taika been in conversation with her 5th grade self, she's been in conversation with us, and she's evolved as a person. And that means something, because that's what coming-of-age films are all about. Because as the great Andrei Tarkovsky said, the allotted function of art is not, as is often suspected, to put across ideas, to propagate thoughts, to serve as an example. Instead, it is to plow and harrow a man's soul, rendering capable of turning to good. And I think this film allows us that. It gives us a peek into a way that we, ourselves, could also change. And change for the better. And so, without further ado, I know I've babbled on for way too long, especially for this movie. I invite you to watch one of my favorite films from the great Studio Ghibli, and just experience what I believe to be a really great piece of cinema. So without further ado, sit back, relax, and enjoy tonight's screening of the 1991 Studio Ghibli film from director Isao Takahata, Only Yesterday.